In the tradition of Malcolm X, peace be unto you. We've got snakes on the soul plane, and we should be careful for that reason. There is a network with deep roots in the community of descendants of slaves who promote the propaganda of white supremacy. And we should watch out for them, because they are at work to guide us as sheep to the slaughter, to support white supremacist candidates. I want to talk to you about that for a few minutes. Let me just make a few points. We've got two orientations that are connected to the same root of white supremacy, political agenda. On the one hand, we have a secular version of white supremacy, and on the other hand, we have a religious version of white supremacist political agenda at work on molding our attitudes, molding our political perceptions, so that we are led to vote along one or the other tracks. Let's first talk about the New York Times and their recent effort to promote a project which they called the 1619 Project, which happens to emerge at this time when Democratic candidates are vying for nomination to be the Democratic presidential candidate to stand off against Donald Trump. Now, there's a long history of the New York Times newspaper. I've put up here for you to see graphically the candidates that they have historically supported. If you look closely, going back into the 19th century and then through the 20th century, you will see that they have promoted primarily or endorsed primarily Democratic candidates, switching from Republican to Democrat after the Civil War. Now, keep in mind also that the Democratic Party is the party, the political party in the United States, which opposed civil rights legislation throughout the 20th century and was the political party of the Confederacy. Now, let's establish some facts as we talk about contemporary politics in relationship to the New York Times. Hillary Clinton and Bill Clinton are white supremacists. Let's establish that fact. That is a truth. The New York Times endorsed both Hillary and Bill Clinton throughout their political careers. Therefore, we can conclude with absolute certainty that the New York Times is a news and opinion medium for a white supremacist, neoliberal political agenda. That's an established truth. Now, the 1619 Project is a major initiative from the New York Times observing the 400th anniversary of the beginning of American slavery, according to its own print. It aims, according to its print, to reframe the country's history, understanding 1619 as our true founding, and placing the consequences of slavery and the contributions of Black Americans at the very center of the story we tell ourselves about who we are, end quote. There are some problems with that paragraph. And I'm quite sure that perhaps you've already identified it. But let's go on and examine the New York Times and its relationship to this so-called project and why it is in operation now at this time as we move close to a presidential election. They claim that their purpose is to re-examine the legacy of slavery in the United States. And of course, again, they've timed it for the 400th anniversary of the arrival in America of the first enslaved people from West Africa. They have selected one of their journalists, Nicole Hannah Jones, to be the front person, to be the mouthpiece. And she is intelligent, and she is somewhat charismatic. Let there be no doubt about that. But as we plow deeper into the roots of the white supremacist propaganda methodology, Miss Jones or Mrs. Jones is not a new mouthpiece phenomenon. So the New York Times is a white supremacist instrument of propaganda. Now, let's move to the second wing of this effort, of this propaganda effort that we are beginning to see unfold. The National Baptist Convention has a conference that has been in process since August 6th called the Angela Project. Now, listen closely, because their claim is that they are celebrating the anniversary of the arrival of the first African person to be enslaved in the Americas. What they claim is that there is an illusion of inclusion, that there's 50 years of downward mobility in Black America. The point that I'm trying to imply to you here is that they're not telling us anything new. They're not telling us something that we don't already know. They're not telling us something that we haven't known for the last 50 years. But what they're not making clear is this. The National Baptist Convention endorsed a neoliberal candidate, Hillary Clinton, for president in 2016. Now, Hillary Clinton, as I stated before, is a white supremacist. Let there be no doubt about that. And she is a warmonger. She is responsible for the death of countless thousands of men, women, and children in Africa and throughout the world. Therefore, the National Baptist Convention and their Angela Conference was and is a liberal religious medium for a white supremacist political agenda. They have embraced the neoliberal agenda, and we should be mindful of that. So, if Hillary Clinton, as I stated, is a neoliberal white supremacist who has committed atrocious crimes against humanity around the world, What should we think of Yvette Carnell and Antonio Moore, who have participated and have continued to participate in this conference with the National Baptist Convention? Well, again, the National Baptist Convention is a liberal religious medium for a white supremacist political agenda. And the fact is that because Yvette Carnell and Antonio Moore, by their acts, endorsed the National Baptist Convention, it follows that Yvette Carnell and Antonio Moore, by their acts, endorse a neoliberal white supremacist political agenda. That follows necessarily. Now, ask yourself this question. Why wasn't Cornel West a speaker at the National Baptist Convention Angela Conference? Was it because of his criticism of Barack Obama? Is it because of his current support for Bernie Sanders to be the Democratic nominee to run against Donald Trump? I think that is the reason why he was not invited. Cornel West is an outspoken Christian. Why wouldn't he be invited to the National Baptist Convention to speak during the Angela Project? Well, that would run against the grain of the neoliberal support that the National Baptist Convention has given to the Democratic elite, who, as you recall, in 2016 literally stole the election from Bernie Sanders. Here now we see, on the one hand, the New York Times as a secular version of this propaganda machine, and we see, on the other hand, the National Baptist Convention Conference, a religious version of the same effort to guide African Americans down a path to support a neoliberal candidate who, if their strategy works out, will not be Bernie Sanders. The New York Times and organizations like the National Baptist Convention have the same political agenda. That is to elect a neoliberal as candidate to run against Donald Trump. You may think, well, what is the basis of my argument? How does this network operate? Where does this network originate? We've got to go back in time. Under President Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson created the first official propaganda network in the United States under Executive Order 2594. I encourage you to read it yourself. Under Executive Order 2594, Wilson established the first modern propaganda office called the Committee on Public Information. It was headed by a man named George Creel. Creel boasted that in 18 months, his 75,000 volunteers delivered over 7.5 million four-minute orations, that is, speeches, to over 300 million listeners in a nation of 103 million people. Now, what I am suggesting to you is that when you see people like Hannah Jones, when you see Yvette Carnell and Antonio Moore, and those they associate with in the Angela Conference, what we are seeing is the propaganda machine that is used to manipulate African Americans. And both of those efforts stem from the same propaganda network that was started under the Woodrow Wilson administration through that committee which I have informed you of. That committee was set up to stifle free speech. You can read the account of George Crill's efforts in the book that he wrote, How We Advertised America. It should have been stated how we propagandized in America. And here you can see several chapters which I have marked for you. The speakers that were used were called the 4-Minute Men. And the stated goal was the fight for the mind of mankind. And their purpose was to do this through film. Their purpose was to do it through pamphlets and books. Their purpose was to do it by spying neighbor on neighbor. And today we have the same pattern, except we have television, we have the internet, we still have the churches, and we see this propaganda machine acting out in those venues today. For example, Tony Brown stated in a book he wrote many years ago that Webb Du Bois was hired by the United States War Department to spy on black churches, and he did. Webb Du Bois was also used as a semi-diplomat to Liberia to further the interest of the Firestone Rubber Company. Dr. King's organization was spied upon by African Americans who infiltrated the various organizations that were set up to support Dr. King throughout the United States and particularly in the state of Mississippi. You should see the documentary, Spies in Mississippi. See that documentary, because those who were spying, in many instances, were Baptist ministers, having meetings and reporting them immediately to the FBI or to other intelligence agencies working with the federal government or state governments throughout the United States. The group of spies were called the 4-Minute Men. And they would be called at any moment to go and speak, to propagandize for the power elite, for white supremacists in this nation. As you can see here, I've highlighted, it worked with the post office to censor seditious counter-propaganda. Krill set up divisions in his new agency to produce and distribute innumerable copies of pamphlets, newspaper releases, magazine advertisements, films, school campaigns, and the speeches of the 4-Minute Men. The CPI trained thousands of volunteer speakers to make patriotic appeals during the 4-minute breaks needed to change reels in movie theaters. They also spoke at churches, lodges, fraternal organizations, labor unions, and even logging camps. You cannot be certain that the people who are speaking to you using the reparations argument, splattering their talks with graphs and data about how poor you are, to be authentic, to be sincere. Let me go even further. Most of them are on the payroll of some agency or some white supremacist think tank. Here we have evidence that Yvette Carnell is in association with the National Black Baptist Convention that supported Hillary Clinton, that supports neoliberal political agenda. And that is evidence that she is not authentic and that she thirsts for money and recognition. Oh, she's real thirsty. So what we have here is a symmetrical political agenda. And what that means is that two strategies or plans overlap proportionately. The New York Times is an example of one. And they have Mrs. Jones to lure you into their camp, to take you down the trail that leads to a neoliberal candidate in the Democratic Party. The other is a religious form or version. Look at your left hand. Look at your right hand. Put them together. What you see now is that the two are symmetrical. And that is the point that I'm trying to make to you. There is no difference between them. They are rooted in the same network of propaganda. And you must do a thorough analysis before you fall into the trap of perceiving them as authentic efforts to give you a clear vision of what course of political action you should take. You see, whether the candidate that they select wins or lose, white supremacists win because Trump's policies are more or less the same policies of all the neoliberal presidents that we've ever had, with the exception perhaps of Lyndon Johnson. It doesn't matter if they get a neoliberal Democrat to run against Trump and Trump loses, the policies are going to remain the same. If Trump wins, the policies are going to remain the same. But what the Democrats need is that they need your vote. And the purpose of the National Baptist Convention and the purpose of the New York Times 1619 Project is simply this: stop Bernie Sanders. Stop Bernie Sanders. That is their purpose. And that means they must get you to vote for one of their neoliberal candidates. And now all you need do is sit back and watch it unfold. I am Dr. Stephen Nur Ahmed. Peace be unto you.
I really enjoyed this video, and I hope you did as well. If you enjoyed Stephen's talk, please support this channel, thumbs up, and share this video. And please do not forget to subscribe.